The sentence hit him like a steel door slamming shut. You'll never be nothing. Not whispered. Pronounced like a prophecy. Like a contract someone else had signed on his life without his consent. He carried it the way a kid carries a stone in his shoe. Step by grinding step. Through classrooms that dinged him for daydreaming. Through Sundays where the choir sang about mercy he did not yet feel. Through nights so long they felt like a second life. He would learn in time that some prophecies are only mirrors for the smallness of the person speaking. He would learn, too, that a door, slammed hard enough, jostles loose the whole frame. What no one saw then, least of all the people who thought they knew how his story ended, was that the boy who tried to disappear in the back row would grow up to build a world. Not a room, not a studio apartment of an idea, but a world. Streets, sound stages, lights that come up on cue. Entire neighborhoods of story where he could give the mic to people who had been told, for generations, to speak only in the background. He would become the kind of man whose name alone pays the rent on a dream. And he would do it with a grin that said he had heard the prophecy and declined. This is a story about racism that comes in headlines and in lowercase, in the system and in the shrug. About poverty that trains a mind to weigh every choice as if the balance is rigged. About the way survival can harden in a boy's chest until he begins to believe endurance is all a life can be. It's the story of Tyler Perry, of a child who wrote letters to himself to stay alive, a teenager who learned the sound of his own laughter in a world that tried to mute it, a man who turned no into brick and never into deeds. It is meant to hurt and to heal. It's meant to remind you that the things we most want to throw away, our pasts, our pain, the names we were called, can be the very materials we use to build the house we were always meant to inhabit. Before he was a mogul with a city inside his gates, he was a boy in a small shotgun house in New Orleans, where the summer heat came in and sat down as if it had been invited. The house was narrow, the kind of place that trains you to move through the world sideways, politely, letting other people pass. He learned early to read voices, to categorize footsteps on the porch, a neighbor coming for sugar, a bill collector ready to turn kindness off at the meter, a father returning home like weather. There were days when the roof rattled, with rain and the church drums echoed through the blocks, and it felt almost possible to believe that the Lord took the edge off things like hunger and fear, simply by being named out loud. There were other days when faith felt like furniture, good to lean on, not much comfort if the house itself was on fire. His mother taught him patience as a survival art. Get to school, sit up straight. Don't make yourself a target. She taught him, too, to pull joy out of thin air when joy refused to arrive on its own. The way a good pot of red beans and rice might transform a Monday. The way a hymn sung just right can repair a minute of a life, even if it can't fix the whole thing. She was the first editor of his days, crossing out what needed to go and underlining what needed to stay. And even when she was too tired to speak, her hands continued the lesson. The woman wrote love in dinners and pressed shirts in the kind of corrections that sting, because they are true. School was a performance he hadn't yet learned the lines to. He passed some classes by listening to the cadence of the teacher's voice and imitating it, not because he understood the content, but because he understood people. Others he barely scraped through, a mind in flight and a body in a seat no one had saved for him. In a different world, a counselor would have heard the way he told stories, how he laced humor into hard truths, and would have steered him onto a stage. In his world, people were too busy keeping the lights on to notice that a boy was already becoming the man who'd power the lights for others. Outside the walls of his life, a country was trying and failing to teach itself the difference between policy and justice. The wounds of Jim Crow were fresh enough to ache, even where the paint on the signs had been scraped off. In the movies, black men were often props to someone else's journey, comedy relief or threat, their lives flattened like old bills under a paperweight. In the neighborhoods he knew, black men were the whole plot, fathers and uncles and friends and cousins doing the math that poor people do, rent against a check, dignity against a job that steals it, hope against the shapes despair is always inventing. The racial climate was a weather system that never moved on, and every family he knew had its own barometer. When the world hurt too much, he found a way to leave without leaving. He wrote, At first, it was scribbles in the margins of a notebook, then letters to himself, then whole pages addressed to a future he couldn't yet picture. He wrote himself kinder parents, softer nights, a day when the fear that shook his body for no reason might finally stand down. Once on daytime television, he heard someone say that writing trauma out could pull claws from its paws. He didn't know if it was true. He tried anyway. He poured into those pages the boy he could not be in public, the one who could crack a joke and have it land as love and not as insolence, the one who could tell the truth and not be punished for it. He grew into a young man who could make a room laugh, and a woman sigh, and a man lean forward to hear the end of the sentence. He worked jobs that paid his body and begged his mind to wait. A check-cashing place, a warehouse, the kind of work that leaves your hands rough and your heart yearning. And then, one day, he took the things he had written in private and pressed them into a playbill. The title was a declaration, "I know I've been changed." He rented a little theater, used what savings he had, put chairs in rows, dragged a borrowed couch onto the stage, and waited to see if anyone else believed in the life he had written as hard as he did. The first night should have changed everything. He stood in the dark at the edge of the wings and watched a story that had almost eaten him alive become a thing that fed other people. The audience cried in the places he had cried while writing it, and laughed in the places he had laughed alone. And afterward they hugged him, the kind of hug that says, "Thank you for telling the truth so I could find mine." A few weeks later, he learned the practical lesson that art cannot teach you. Adoration does not pay the rental fee on a theater. The show closed. The money was gone. The people who said they'd come again got busy. The man whose dream had seemed inevitable learned that even inevitability can be postponed. He went broke with embarrassment, and then with relief. The way you do when you realize you have finally fallen as far as you can. He slept in his car, which sounds noble in a story and is anything but. When your back is a map of knots and your belly is a clock you can't wind. Showers were borrowed. Meals, too. A friend slipped him $20 bills as if handing him excuses. He kept writing. He rewrote. He revised. He prayed without trying to remember the right words, which is how prayer works best anyway. An audition for a role in someone else's play because your own play cannot feed you until the world says it can. He stood in front of a table of men who had learned to assess a life in 30 seconds, and looked him up and down and said the quiet part out loud. "You don't have the look," the man said, and then added the words that turned into a fire in his throat. Too black, too big, too southern, too everything that scared rooms like this. "Try comedy," another man smirked, as if comedy were a punishment for men who could not be taken seriously. He nodded and left, and then stood in the hallway and let the humiliation evaporate like a spill on linoleum. On the way home, he did a small act of defiance. He laughed. He wrote a scene that night where a grandmother snapped back at a world determined to flatten her. And in that scene, a woman named Medea took her first breath. He mounted the play again in a bigger hall this time. It failed, then sputtered, then caught. The news seemed uninterested. The critics were too busy to be bothered. But the audience, black families who had never seen their precise heartbreaks and hilarity reflected. Church women who had endured enough tragedy to make a Greek chorus jealous. Men who cheered truth-telling disguised as jokes found him. They came on Friday nights after long weeks, and they came on Sunday afternoons dressed like resurrection. They paid in cash and applause and trust. The show moved to a larger venue, then another, then a tour. He collected names like a man building a nation. Racism did what it does. It adjusted. Disguised itself as taste, as gatekeeping, as broad appeal. He was told by people who didn't look like him that his stories were too specific, and that specificity, in their minds, always meant too black. He was told by some who did look like him that his characters were too loud, too country, too much like the aunties in their kitchens, and not enough like the tidy fictions TV had fed them about who they were supposed to be. He filed these comments the way a man files nails he has no time to trim, smooth enough so they wouldn't snag his work, sharp enough to defend him if needed. One night, driving home from a late rehearsal, lights lit up behind him in his rearview mirror, and the tiredness in his bones turned into fear in his chest. He pulled over, hands at 10 and 2, hard on hold. Questions that had nothing to do with the reason he was supposedly stopped arrived like old friends who never forget to ruin a party. He went home afterward and could not sleep, and wrote a monologue about men who learned to be polite as a way of staying alive. The next day at rehearsal, he asked the cast to read it, not because he had a plan, but because sometimes the only thing you can do with terror is turn it into a tool. The audience cried in the places he had cried while writing it, and laughed in the places he had laughed alone. And then they stood, not because the show was over, but because they recognized themselves and could not sit anymore. The world took notice in increments. A DVD sold out of trunks. A movie made without the blessing of anyone who decides what is culture and what is content. Suddenly, the phone calls changed tone. People who had not returned his calls years ago acted like they'd been in touch all along. The men at the table asked if he might like to partner, now that he had proven he could print money. He smiled with all his teeth and said he'd think about it, and by think about it, he meant build my own. Struggle for him was not only against poverty and racism. It was against the little compromises that promise relief and then collect on your soul with interest. He learned which ones he could afford and which ones he could not. He cut deals that didn't cut him off from himself. He put people to work, actors who'd been waiting rooms for years without their names ever being called, writers who had figured out they'd have to invent their own lanes, grips and lighting techs who could set a rig blindfolded and only needed someone to pay them on time and thank them out loud. He built companies within companies, a touring arm, a film crew, a TV branch, an army of ticket takers and ushers and box office staff who learned that their work, too, was an act of hospitality disguised as logistics. He was criticized for the boisterousness of his comedy, for the ease with which it moved masses, for the ways his characters sometimes spoke in a key not to everyone's taste. Some of it he took into the workshop of his mind and improved upon. Some of it he left where it fell, because criticism can become a form of control when you are not careful, a way of telling a story what shape it's allowed to take. He refused to forget who he was making the work for, the people who turned their wallets inside out to come see him when no one else cared, the ones who needed laughter like medicine, the ones who needed to see a grandmother be an engine of truth, not just a prop for nostalgia. He kept his eye on the numbers without letting the numbers tell him yes or no. He learned about real estate and tax credits and the ancient art of getting funding without letting the funder think they own you. He drove past a former army base and saw not the remnants of a military past, but the bones of a creative future. He learned the length of 330 acres by walking it. He saw in the crumbling buildings and grass that had grown arrogant the outlines of streets that did not exist yet. He learned again to read footsteps, the footsteps of crews that would one day rattle across those echoing floors, the footsteps of actors who would rehearse there until they forgot to be anyone but the person they were being paid to be, the footsteps of a man who wanted to build a home for stories that had been sleeping under other people's porches for too long. There were city meetings where men in suits asked him, politely and then less politely, if he knew what he was doing. He considered telling them that knowing what you are doing is often a luxury reserved for those who have not had to make do. He decided instead to show them. He worked the permits until the permits worked for him. He hired and hired again. Architects, carpenters, electricians, set designers who begin with a sketch and end with a street. He stood in the red clay and imagined rain. He stood under new ceilings and said, the kind of small prayer a man says when he knows he has asked more of the world than the world thought it would have to give. He kept acting because the first voice to save him was his own. He wrote himself into the stories because they needed a heartbeat he could supply. He wrote others in too, the way a man with a big house invites people who have been sleeping standing up to come sit down. He made space for conversations about colorism, about respectability, about what happens to men who spend their lives apologizing for taking up space and then have to learn, suddenly, how to breathe at full size. He made space for women who are always carrying too much and laughing too loudly, whose loudness is a form of oxygen, a way of flushing rooms of their stale air. He made space for faith that doesn't pretend to fix everything, and for forgiveness that refuses to be confused with forgetfulness. The day the gates opened at his studio, the street inside bore his name, but he appeared at the back of a crowd, as if he were sneaking in, as if he still didn't entirely trust that he was allowed to be here. An aerial shot later would reveal a city, sound stages bigger than hangars, backlots that could be anywhere, lawns and lakes and neighborhoods that, within an hour, could be transformed into a time machine. He gave the sound stages names that taught a nation its own lineage. Dorothy, Denzel, Cicely, Sydney, Oprah, Will, Hallie, Spike, Ruby, Harry. He pointed at the brass letters as if he were reading them for the first time, emotion bubbling at the edge of his voice, gratitude thickening every syllable. If you had told the boy who slept in his car that one day he would build a place where those names would live under roofs he paid for, the boy might have laughed to keep from crying. He stood beneath a set that looked like the White House and felt, for a moment, the strange sensation of owning the image of power that for so long had stood above him untouchable. He remembered being told to build a table instead of fighting for a seat at someone else's. He had built a city around that idea. And then the faces started arriving, men and women whose talent had made room for his, now arriving to bless the place with their presence, to be photographed beneath their names, to whisper to the walls the stories of the rooms they had been forced out of, the roles they had been denied, the negations they had metabolized into fuel. On a night that felt like a holiday the country had invented and forgotten to name, he took a microphone and did what he has always done best. He told the story of how a man who kept being told he was too much, too black, too country, too spiritual, too sentimental, too loud, took those twos and built a bridge with them. He said the quiet parts out loud and did not apologize afterward. He thanked his mother, who had written him into the world the first time. He thanked the audiences who had carried him when no one else would. He thanked the small voice inside him that had once spoken through tears and now spoke through a PA system. The work did not stop. The studio was not a trophy. It was a factory of feeling. The next morning the crew call sheet read like any other. Call times, shot lists, a lunch break that would arrive late and be eaten fast if the light did not cooperate. The studio made films and shows and the kind of behind-the-scenes moments that remind you, this is a business before it is a myth. Long days, practical jokes, small kindnesses, schedules that someone's whole life depends on. The gates let more and more people through. A kid from the west end of Atlanta drove by just to see if it was real, and then, months later, found himself holding a cable in a stage where the air conditioning hummed like a blessing. What's the long-term impact of a man deciding to build his own world? It's the jobs, the real kind, not the ribbon-cutting kind. It's the way a city shifts its posture ever so slightly when it realizes the biggest name on the call sheet lives down the street. It's the scholarships that carry a kid across the years it takes to turn talent into a craft. It's the shelter built on land adjacent to the studio, beds and counseling and safety for women and children, and young people made homeless by a world that measures their worth in the wrong currency. It's the grocery bills paid for strangers in line during a pandemic, because sometimes all you can do with your power is hand it to someone else, one receipt at a time. It's also the argument the existence of the studio makes without a word, that you don't need permission when you have a plan and enough stubbornness to see it through. That representation is a kind of charity until it becomes ownership, that the distance between never and now is paved by people who care more about the work than the story being told about the work. It's the phone call to an actor whose number had grown cold and the phrase, "I've got something for you." It's the way he shows up at a funeral without cameras because success is only sweet if you remember who you wanted to share it with in the first place. The story keeps unfolding in the ways that good stories do. Left turns, new characters, an occasional lull in the action that reminds you that even heroes need naps. He continues to make work that makes critics fight with each other, and audiences turn to each other in the dark and say, "That's my aunt," or "That's my brother," or "That's me." He continues to take the heat for refusing to ask people who have been hungry for their share of the culture to go on a diet. He continues to give chances to kids who have more enthusiasm than experience, understanding that the latter is often a byproduct of the former if you just give it time. The studio has weddings now, People who met on the lot returning to make promises to each other on the lawns. The air smelling like flowers and craft services coffee. It has reunions, too. Shows that ended years ago coming back to stand in one place and let the memories wrap them like something warm. It has late nights where the security guards trade stories and early mornings where a director stands in the fog and imagines what the fog could be made to mean. It has, in short, a life. And as for that sentence, you'll never be nothing. It has been folded and refolded and used, improbably, as packing material for the fragile things he transports from one season of his life to the next. It has been rendered harmless by what he built. It has finally been turned into a lesson for other people, that you must be careful what you say to a child, because they will spend the rest of their life proving you right or wrong, and the world would be better served by their victories than by your smallness. What can the rest of us take from this except the obvious and the necessary? That racism is not only a set of laws, it's a set of expectations so low they smother a life before it can stand up. And the fight against it must be fought not only in courtrooms but in classrooms, break rooms, boardrooms, and living rooms. That poverty is not a character flaw but a storm that can be outlasted and outplanned, and that our job is to be the roof, the umbrella, the invitation inside. That one person's refusal to accept the world as it has been laid out can create a lane wide enough for a caravan to pass. If you teach, be careful with your prophecies. If you hire, ask yourself whether your job posting is describing a person you've already met or a person you haven't imagined yet. If you make culture, remember that people hunger for mirrors, not just windows. If you lead, build tables to sit at, not stages to stand on. If you are that kid, the one who hears the words, you will never ring like a bell in your ears. Do not answer the bell by leaving the ring. Answer it by staying, by training, by choosing good people to hold the ropes when your arms are tired. Write letters to yourself if you must. Put them on stage when you can. Do not shrink. If you are too much for a room, that room is too little for you. He was told he would never be anything. He has become the kind of everything that matters. A maker of work and wages, a builder of places where people are hired to be seen, a man big enough to be grateful and small enough to keep learning. He is, in the end, not just what they wish they were, but what we need more of. And the door that slammed? It's a museum piece now, hung in a hallway at the studio as a reminder. Sometimes the best sound in a life is not a door closing, but the echo of it as you walk through your own.